Hi everyone, welcome to the Ikoria Early Access deck preview. I am really excited to share with you some of the decks I've been brewing for the event, and I think that this set is really going to shake up the metagame, maybe return some old archetypes and inject some new archetypes into the mix. So up first, I would like to share with you Boros Feather. For those of you that did not play during the time when the Feather the Redeemed decks were popular, basically this deck is really built around the card Feather the Redeemed, which is a 3/4 flyer for 3 that whenever you cast an instant or sorcery that targets a creature you control, rather than putting it in your graveyard, you exile it and return it to your hand at the end of your turn. So by combining this with some really cheap instants that can protect your creatures or protect Feather, you're able to force through enough damage to end the game and prevent your opponents from removing your key threats. Now, the reason this deck I think is going to make a little bit of a comeback is we got a very powerful 1-mana white spell called Fight as One. As far as I can tell, this is the best effect we've ever had like this. So what it says is choose one or both. Target human and target non-human get +1/+1 and indestructible until the end of turn. So this deck does play a nice combination of human and non-human creatures. And the fact that not only is this a strong protection and pump spell, but potentially could hit 2 of your own creatures for a single mana is really powerful. So there are some other important synergies to know from this deck. The main one is Dreadhorde Arcanist. Dreadhorde Arcanist is a creature that whenever it attacks, you may cast target instant or sorcery with converted mana cost less than or equal to Dreadhorde Arcanist's power from your graveyard without paying its cost. Since we play so many 1-mana instant spells, even if you are not pumping the Dreadhorde Arcanist, you are often able to cast something from your graveyard for free. There are a lot of other new cards that also breathe some life into this deck, and one that I'm interested to play around with is Go for Blood. So this is a fight card. Target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. Obviously, that works well with Feather because you're able to get this back on your end step. But it also has cycling for 1. And in a deck where we are trying to skimp on lands, this can be a nice way to make sure you're hitting a key land drop if you need to. And one of the new cards that I'm including 2 of in the deck is Stormwild Caprador. And I think you can make some really cool plays based around Stormwild Caprador's ability and Go for Blood. And what I mean by that is the Caprador says if non-combat damage would be dealt to the Caprador, prevent that damage and put a +1/+1 counter on Stormwild Caprador for each 1 damage prevented this way. So I can imagine a situation where you have a Stormwild Caprador on the board and your opponent has an Uro, and you are able to fight the Uro to build up your Caprador into a 7/10 and swing in for lethal before they can start gaining life. I think there's going to be some really cool ways you can use your spells to pump this creature. Shock works as well. And it's also obviously incredibly resilient to any sort of removal that is based around damage. So I don't know if this card will make the final tuned version of the deck, but I at least think it's interesting at first glance. And other than that, pretty much self-explanatory. One of the main things to know is that 10th District Legionnaire is a really strong target for all of our 1-mana instants. As it grows, it gets a +1/+1 counter each time a spell targets it, and you get to scry. And in the sideboard, we are playing a new card, Dranith Magistrate. Your opponents can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hands, so this seems like it could be a pretty reasonable hoser of both adventure cards and escape cards. All right, that brings us to our next deck. All right, moving on to deck number 2, Simic Ultra Ramp. So this deck is obviously similar to some of the existing Simic Ramp decks, but there are a few new cards that really give it a pretty substantial improvement. One of the main things that this deck has that is different from the current build is it's much more resilient to things like sweepers or removal spells than the builds that are based around Risen Reef and that need Risen Reef to survive. So the ideal start for this deck is something like Arboreal Grazer on turn 1, putting another land into play. Turn 2, playing a third land, mutating Parcel Beast, which is a new card, onto Arboreal Grazer. When you do this, you will have another land out if you played your land for the turn, and you can immediately tap this new creature to look at the top card of your library, and if it's a land, you can put it on the battlefield untapped. So a pretty significant improvement over even what you can do on turn 2 with Risen Reef. If it's not a land, you get to put it into your hand. So Parcel Beast gives you not only something to do with your Arboreal Grazers, which are often kind of unexciting creatures, but also allows you to ramp really quickly. So if you are able to hit a land off the top of your deck, you can potentially on turn 3 play your 5th land and immediately play out a Nissa. So that is a pretty busted start that this deck is certainly capable of. The top end that I chose to go for was 4 Agent of Treacheries, a Finale of Devastation, and an End Raise Forerunners. I think Agent of Treachery could be really good after the new set hits, especially if people are playing a lot of mutate cards. If you can imagine, they've piled 1 or 2 or 3 cards into a single creature. Stealing that creature with Agent of Treachery is a pretty ridiculous swing. I also love to steal my opponent's lands. That's honestly why I put it in. So being able to power out an Agent of Treachery potentially on turn 4 and take a land seems like quite a beating. One other new card that we have is Migration Path. This is a great ramp spell that you can also cycle for 2. So if it's late in the game and you don't need the lands, this turns into a new card. And sometimes early in the game, if you're not getting up to 4 mana, you could cycle this to smooth your draw as well. So that is Simic Ultra Ramp. In the sideboard, it is mostly the same old stuff. I am including 4 Shifting Ceratops because of the last deck that I am going to show you tonight. I think that we might be fighting through a lot more counter magic. All right. The third deck up, though, is Izzet Rielle. This is a super cool synergistic deck as well. And there's 2 main ideas behind this deck. The first is you are attempting to load up your graveyard with a ton of cheap instant and sorcery spells. When you do this, you are turning on a lot of cards that this matters for. The new one is Blitz of the Thunder Raptor. This card does damage to target creature or planeswalker equal to the number of instant and sorcery spells in your graveyard. And if that creature or planeswalker would die, you exile it instead. The Sprite Dragon is another new card that cares quite a bit about non-creature spells you are casting, and it gets a +1/+1 counter each time you do this. Another card that cares quite a bit about how many instants and sorceries are in your graveyard is the good old Crackling Drake. Crackling Drake has taken a bit of a vacation, but it is back. And this card, if you didn't play with this card during Standard, does 2 important things. First, it draws you a card when it enters the battlefield. It also has power equal to the number of instant and sorcery cards in exile and in your graveyard. So oftentimes this is a very powerful flyer for 4 mana that is replacing itself by drawing a card. And with cards like Maximize Velocity, sometimes you can even attack with it the turn it comes in. Now the second main idea of this deck is all about Rielle the Everwise. And this card has 2 clauses. The first one says that its power is effectively equal to the number of instants and sorceries in your yard. We've heard that before, that's not super exciting. But the second clause is, whenever you discard 1 or more cards for the first time each turn, draw that many cards. So this allows you to take a whole group of cards that require you to discard to cast them and totally mitigate that disadvantage. So for example, Thrill of Possibility, normally you have to discard a card to draw 2 cards, which is kind of underwhelming. Now says draw 2 cards and cycle a card. And same thing for Thirst for Meaning. Draw 3 cards, then cycle 2 cards for free. The Royal Scions. Draw a card, cycle a card for free. So the Rielle the Everwise really transforms some otherwise decent cards into absolutely game-breaking cards and huge sources of card advantage. So that is the Rielle the Everwise Izzet deck. One last thing I'll point out is cards with Jumpstart also are a lot less painful to cast the second time, because when you discard that card to cast it, you are getting a new card for your troubles. So I'm excited to play this. I tend to like blue-red tempo-y decks, and there's so much synergy going on here that I think this deck has a real chance to be a metagame contender. And now on to the final deck. And I have to say, this deck scares me a little bit because I think it might be a little bit too good. So this is the Dimir Flash deck. And the main card that drew my eye to this deck is the Cunning Night Bonder. So this is a 2-drop. It costs 2 hybrid mana, blue or black. And spells with Flash you cast cost 1 less to cast and can't be countered. So if you get this down on turn 2, which you can play it with Flash on the end of their turn, so pretty likely you'll be able to do so, makes so many of your other cards obscenely powerful. Not only does something like a Voracious Great Shark become only a 4-mana card, which you can flash in a 5/4 and counter a creature or artifact spell with, but it also means that, for example, a Sea Dasher Octopus costs only blue, and none of these spells with Flash can be countered. Now, another card that makes me think this deck is going to be absolutely bonkers is the Slitherwisp. So I had to read this one a couple times. It says, Flash, whenever you cast another spell that has Flash, you draw a card and each opponent loses 1 life. A couple things to note about this card. One, it's not when it enters the battlefield. It's when you cast another spell that has Flash. So even if that spell gets countered, you're still getting this trigger, you're drawing a card, and your opponent is losing 1 life. So if you imagine playing this deck against a typical or traditional control deck, if you have a Slitherwisp on the battlefield and they're trying to fight you with counter magic, you're getting an extra card every time that exchange happens, and you're pressuring their life total. So I could see Slitherwisp being a really strong draw into this Dimir Flash deck. I'm going to go back to the Octopus as well. This card, if you are able to resolve it onto an empty board, is just an immediate source of card advantage after the first attack. Every time it deals combat damage to a player, you are drawing a card. So a lot of the slower decks are going to be even more punished by this build, because not only is it going to be hard to resolve their spells, but also you're going to be drawing an additional card each turn if they're not playing to the board. And then we have some old classics like the Brineborn Cutthroats and the Spectral Sailors, which are really good early Flash plays and work really well with cards like Slitherwisp. Lastly, we also even have a way to come back from behind. And that's one thing that the Simic Flash decks tend to lack, is if a deck is able to get underneath them, they really don't have any way to catch up. But because we are now dipping into black, we get a real removal spell like Heartless Act, which is an incredibly powerful instant from the new set. Destroy target creature with no counters on it, or remove up to 3 counters from target creature. The vast majority of the time, I am expecting to use it for its first mode. But also, we even have the 4 Brazen Borrowers as a way to bounce a meaningful permanent, and then we could potentially both bounce and play this on the same turn if we have a Cunning Night Bonder out for only 4 mana. So yeah, I think this Dimir Flash deck is the real deal. I'm a little bit worried that it's going to end up being too strong. We shall see if that pans out. And I should also mention some small upgrades. We get Neutralized now, and it might not look that exciting, but the fact that you can cycle it for 2 mana is a big deal. If you are in a situation where you are behind and can't sit on a counterspell, you can cash that in for a new card. It can smooth out a draw if you're stuck on 2 lands. It is a pretty significant upgrade as well. So yeah, this is Dimir Flash. This is the one I suspect will be the most powerful on day 1. And I'm excited to play all of these decks in the early access event. So thank you, Wizards, for the invite to that. And hopefully you can tune in and see the cards in action tomorrow, anytime after 4 o'clock Pacific. All right. See you then. Bye.